So far I've created entities by dragging images to the map editor, then used the properties editor to configure the entity's properties. If I want to create multiple copies of an entity, I could simply repeat this process and drag the same image to the map several times, then assign each entity its properties, but this would be pretty tedious. Another option would be to create and configure one entity, then copy and paste this entity several times in the map. Each resulting entity would have a copy of the original's properties. The second option makes creating the entities faster, but making changes to common properties is still difficult. This tutorial will demonstrate how reusable entity definitions can be created. I'll also show how entities inherit properties from parent entities. I'll begin by creating an entity definition. Right-click on the Entities folder and select New Other. Choose the SMEd category and select Entity, then click Next. Now give the entity a name and click Finish. The Entity Editor window automatically opens, showing the newly created entity. Note that the Explorer tree context is set to the new entity. Chuck is going to have some unique properties, as well as some inherited properties from a parent entity I'll create later. Let's begin by assigning Chuck an image. Notice that Chuck's size and scale properties are currently set to 0. If I drag the guy.png image onto the editor, you'll see the image rendered in the editor. Also notice that the size and scale properties have changed. The size property, which is the entity size in meters, was assigned a value computed from the image dimensions in pixels and the project's pixels per meter property. You can access the project's properties by right-clicking on the project name in the Project Explorer. The scale property represents the corresponding scale factor, which, when applied to a normalized unit model, results in the desired entity size. If I open the Properties editor, you can see two properties, image reference and scale. Note that the size property is a computed value, is not actually stored anywhere. Now let's create the parent entity. Once again, I'll right-click on the Entities folder. Notice that the New Entity action was added to the pop-up menu. I now have a second entity editor to edit the People entity. Next, I'll assign some properties to the entity. Select the entity in the Explorer tree and open the Properties editor. Let's add a health property and set it to 100. Finally, I want to assign Chuck's parent entity. Select the Chuck entity editor. Using the Entities palette, drag the People entity onto the editor. Notice that the Explorer tree now shows a subnode below the Chuck entity node. For entity inheritance, the Explorer tree is inverted, showing children before parents. If I examine Chuck's properties once again, you now see inherited properties in addition to the entity's own properties. Inherited property names appear in gray. Hovering over the property shows a tooltip indicating that this is a parent property. To change this property value, you can either edit the parent entity, or you can override the property in the child entity. Let's change the value to 50. The property appears with a yellow highlight, and the tooltip now indicates that this property hides a parent property. If I delete the child's health property, the inherited parent property is restored. I now have an entity definition which can be reused across multiple maps. If I need to modify Chuck's properties in the future, I can edit the entity definition without having to modify any maps that may contain instances of this entity. That's all there is to creating reusable entity definitions and entity inheritance. In the next tutorial, I'll create a 2D model for this entity.